Now, if you follow these things, these important issues around the world as I do, you'll know that there's been an increase in anti-Semitism across the world, particularly in Europe in recent years. And there's disturbing reports today that we're seeing an increase in anti-Semitism in schools in Australia, which is just shocking. And I want to find out more of this. I'm joined from the Sydney CBD by Vic Alhadeff, who heads up the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies. Thanks for joining us, Vic. Tell us about what you've found. What is the evidence of this increase in anti-Semitism from teenagers, from kids at school?
At the high school level, at the tertiary level, and increasingly concerning as well, even at the primary school level. Just a couple of recent examples of that, Chris. I recently had a call from the deputy principal of one of the leading private girls' schools here in Sydney. And the deputy principal was mortified, as he himself acknowledged, to discover that 3 of their senior students, 3 year 11 students, had posted on Twitter messages like, "We will gas the Jews, we will burn the Jews, we hate the Jews," and then a bizarre pose with their arms in the shape of a Nazi swastika. And to the credit of the school, to the credit of the deputy principal, they were appalled by this. They called the Jewish Board of Deputies to have a discussion on how we could address this. And with the agreement of the school, I had a meeting with those 3 students, with the deputy principal and with a school counsellor, in which we talked about these issues. And I invited the students to talk about themselves, about their dreams, their aspirations, and how we came to be having this discussion, what led to this. And it began, said one of the students, as a joke. And so I said, I took in some photographs from the Holocaust. I took in some photographs of Jewish children just doing what kids do, and said to the 3 students, "So are you saying that these are the people who should be gassed and who should be burnt?" And I think just getting through to the students on a personal level, it did get through to them. 2 of the students were in tears, and the school suspended the students for a number of days and had them do 30 hours of community service, 15 in the wider community, 15 in the Jewish community. And 2 lessons come out of that, Chris. One is that social media, while it can be a wonderful device, can also be toxic. And so these students had gone onto social media, gone onto Twitter to put out this hateful, toxic message. And the second message that comes out of that is that there is an obligation by social media platforms to monitor what is being put out there. And so if people are putting out such hateful messages, bigotry against any group of people in society, that should not be given a platform. And that's the other important message that comes out of that one particular example.
Look, and the way you've combated this by educating people effectively to understand what they're buying into is admirable, but we've had other instances where there's been physical harm and physical threats involved. I recall one in the Randwick area on a school bus a couple of years ago. Why is this on the rise? Where is it stemming from? What do you believe is generating the rise of anti-Semitism? Because you would be more aware than I am that this has been noticeable in Europe as well.
We are noticing an increase in Europe. We are noticing an increase, sadly, here in Australia as well. And it's a number of factors play into it, Chris. So using social media as a ready tool is one example which certainly lends itself. And even when one takes it to the even more serious level of terrorism, we saw in Christchurch, we saw in the terrorist attacks recently on a number of synagogues in the United States, where those who carried out those attacks had been active in social media on particular platforms which engage in bigotry, in incitement to violence. So that is one issue. Another one is that there is an increasing tolerance of intolerance. In other words, in some of the recent incidents involving school kids, and even in primary school kids, one has to ask the question, where are children hearing this? So an incident which came to our desk just a couple of weeks ago, again, one of the major public schools here in Sydney, the students had a lesson in modern history about the Holocaust. The Holocaust was the murder of 6 million Jews. And one of the students shouted out in class, well, the Jews deserved it anyway. The even more disturbing part of that little scenario was that the teacher in the class had no response to that, let it go. And so, first of all, where's that student getting that poisonous message from? Secondly, where is the obligation on that high school teacher to address that? And by not addressing it, that teacher was telling his or her students, well, that sort of toxic, hateful response is actually acceptable. And so there's an obligation on all of us, whether it's as parents at the dinner table, as educators, as politicians, to call out and condemn all forms of bigotry whenever and wherever we see it. Because not doing so, A, leaves issues unresolved, and B, sends a message that this is acceptable. And this is not what Australia is about. We are the greatest multicultural nation in the world. We have 200 different communities living overwhelmingly in peace, with respect to one another. But it is these sorts of incidents which need to be called out when they happen, because otherwise it puts all of us at risk.
Yeah, it is disgusting. I think we've got pictures here of swastikas painted on a synagogue in Bondi earlier this year. I mean, this sort of thing is, as you say, just not what you should expect or accept in Australia. This is down at Bondi Beach, on the beach wall there, not at the synagogue. Now, this sort of thing is alarming because of what it points to, the feelings it points to. But, of course, Vic, what a lot of people might not comprehend unless they drive past synagogues or Jewish schools regularly in Sydney and Melbourne is how so many of these institutions are patrolled by armed guards. Now, that's a tragic reality, isn't it?
It is a tragic reality. And in fact, Chris, as recently as last night, one of our synagogues here in Sydney was daubed with a swastika, and with even more hateful messages smeared on that synagogue wall. And it's not for me to remind Australians that the swastika, tens of thousands of Australians lost their lives fighting against that swastika. The swastika represented also the murder of 6 million Jewish people. And so when a swastika suddenly appears in a place of Jewish worship or in Bondi, it is not just graffiti. It is the ultimate hateful message. And yes, it is deeply concerning.
Yeah, it is deeply concerning indeed. And look, there's a worry here about the equivalence in the debate, because these instances don't get enough media attention. They are not called out dramatically in the mainstream media, certainly not by the ABC and others. Yet we've seen hysteria sometimes. Now, I've got to be clear. I don't want to see discrimination against anybody of any race or any religion, or for wearing a hijab or for wearing the Jewish prayer cap. I'm against all of that. But we've had, for instance, during the Sydney Martin Place siege, the fabricated instance. We now know a fabricated instance of discrimination against Muslims in Australia, the I'll Ride With You campaign, and there's a massive media pile on this about an incident that did not occur. Yet we don't see people speaking out, highlighting and condemning this rampant anti-Semitism in some of our communities.
Chris, all forms of bigotry need to be called out and condemned. Somebody once said, if there's one thing I cannot stand, it's intolerance. And that applies to any sector at all in society. It is not what we're about. And I have to say, it's just because you mentioned the ABC in this conversation, I have to say that I have just hours ago just done an interview with the ABC as well on this particular issue. So they, as we sit here today, they certainly are looking at this issue. But the important issue is that we are seeing discrimination and bigotry, racism and race hatred across so many sectors. Just a few months ago, the Keep New South Wales Safe campaign, of which I had the honour to be the spokesperson, led a campaign which resulted in legislative reform. It resulted in a new law being put into place here in New South Wales. This law is called Section 93Z. And this law says that there is now a crime to incite violence on the basis of race, religion, gender, sexuality, and a number of other categories, member of the police, member of the armed forces, etc. And to the credit of the New South Wales government, it enacted this law, and ideally this law should become a federal law, because there should be no incitement to violence permitted whatsoever, not against any group, not against any sector, whether it's women, Filipinos, gays, or whatever it is. And so, to the credit of New South Wales government and Parliament, that offence of inciting violence on those categories is now a crime in the Crimes Act, and ideally, that sort of law should be national, should be in every state, should be right across the country. because it is not what we're about. And as Australians, 95% of Australians will be condemning all forms of incitement to violence. It is not what we're about in this greatest of countries.
Vic, I'm going to ask you if you just switch to international affairs for a moment and get your thoughts on what's happening in the Middle East. We know, of course, that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is now dead. That is a good thing when it comes to the future of the Islamic State organisation. But at the same time, you've got Donald Trump pulling out of northern Syria and the protection of the Kurds there. Are you concerned about, what are your thoughts on what all this means for the future security of Israel, particularly the growing influence, the increased influence now of Iran and Russia in the region?
Somebody wiser than me once said that the biggest concern for Israel is instability. The biggest concern for Israel in that part of the world, in one word, is Iran. And if one goes to Google, one doesn't have to spend more than a nanosecond to find repeated statements by Iran that its ultimate aim is the destruction of Israel. And to that end, it has close alliances with Hezbollah, which is in southern Lebanon, which has a reported 120,000, 150,000 missiles pointed at Israel with ability to cover all of Israel. So there is a notional corridor which goes from Iran, through Iraq, through Syria, all the way to the border of Israel. So for the first time, it literally has Iranian presence or proxies on its border. So that is its single major concern. That is its existential threat that it faces, that Iran, with its allies, Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, and other fighters, posing a real-life threat to Israel. That is its major concern.
Vic Alhadeff, thanks so much for joining us. I appreciate it.